Good morning, everyone. This is the weekly Bridges of Meaning live stream question and answer. And we are coming to you from no place, which is the internet, and every place at once. And we have some of the usual cast of characters assembled. If you want to ask a question, and we don't actually have a huge number of questions, and I've already looked over some of them and I can't answer them. So if you would like to ask a question, Rick will drop a link into the chat on the YouTube, and you can get into the Bridges of Meaning Discord, and you can ask a question by writing it in PVK, questions for PVK, or you can just come into the PVK Q&A recorded voice chat and ask your question with your real live voice, and just turn down your internet radio. Those of you who are used to radio call-in shows will know what I'm talking about. Before I dive into the questions, I am not going to repeat, because last week I at the end of the questions that I had at the beginning of the thing, I said starting at the bottom today, and I started at the bottom last week, so now I know where I started. So anybody have a question? Anyone who is in the voice chat have a question they would like to ask before I dive into the written questions? It's so funny. I tell Rick, because, I open up rando slots and they fill up almost immediately, but when I open up questions in the Q&A sessions, everybody's quiet. People are shy of being on a live stream. That's reasonable. But all right, I'll dive into the questions, and I'll have more time for voice questions live as we go through, because we're not really underwater with questions, and a bunch of these that are asked I don't really have an answer for. So first question by Psycho Bible. Hi, Paul. I'm curious what your reaction is to Paul Maxwell saying he's no longer a Christian. Any signs for us to notice in his self-wire videos? I have some thoughts, but curious about yours. I think personalism is a real thing, and so part of what I do on the internet, I treat internet avatars differently than I treat people in real life. And what I mean by that is I've got not a big, but I've got a little relationship with Paul Maxwell. He and I have spoken on the phone a variety of times over the last number of months and years. And it's it's sort of hard to know how to categorize friend. We should probably delimit some of these words, because, is a Facebook friend really a friend? But what all of this is to say that I want to be very careful about doing any public commentary on looking at an Instagram video, which it was obviously emotional and of a moment, and then usually when something like that happens to someone that I actually have a personal relationship with, and an email address and a phone number and some of those things, I'll often reach out and say, well, do you want to talk? And sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't. And so in a case like this, I'll usually not say anything in public, because I wouldn't want to damage anything personal in terms of a personal relationship. Whereas I treat people who are out there on Twitter or YouTube or Instagram making public declarations, I usually say things like, I don't know this person personally, and so any comment that I make really only relates to the public avatar. And what I do in that is basically make a disclaimer that I could be very wrong, because I've got enough of a public avatar to know that people will respond to my public avatar, and a good bit of that will usually be projection, as are probably my commentaries on other public avatars. And so all are subject to possible revision upon further information and analysis. So there's also something about this, about the identity as Christian. So I've been If you looked at the video I released this morning, I've been watching God is Gray, a YouTuber who I've been watching Pope Joe, and I did a video on some of her tweets. I watch some of these people because I want to understand. I want to understand what's going on in sometimes their deconstruction, or sometimes it's a fairly radical transformation of their definition of a Christian. I tell people sometimes that when people deconstruct, I don't necessarily see that as a negative thing, because sometimes if someone was formed in a particular manifestation or identity as a Christian, and there needs to be a transformation for them to become a better Christian, more like Christ, sometimes a deconstruction is a vital aspect of that transformation. Look at the Apostle Peter. Peter denies Christ. Now, did Peter stop being a Christian when Peter denied Christ? Well, suddenly all of this necessary terminology that we have with respect to what a Christian is sort of gets laid on the shelf while the real work underneath happens. There was something really fundamental about Peter's Christian formation and his denial of Christ. Now notice again, I'm using in some senses a historical and biblical avatar to discuss something that I have no, this might come as a great shock to some of you, but I have no personal, I don't have a personal relationship with the Apostle Peter. There's about 2,000 years that separate us historically. And the Apostle Peter has never come to me in a dream, and the Apostle Peter has never revealed himself to me in any other way. So I think this is part of the reason why having public stories and public avatars are important. But Peter's denial, I think, was important for Peter's continual faith formation. And then, of course, there's John 21 with Peter's restoration, and Jesus asks him 3 times. And so there's a game that gets played on the internet with these labels and these tribes, and that game is inevitable, and the game has its function. But when I deal with people one-on-one in a personal relationship, I sort of hold that game at bay, because this is sort of a corollary to my rule in small group studies that I would rather have people say something heretical and unorthodox if they really believe it, and they really believe it to be true, because for me then that helps me kind of understand where they're at. And so I don't know what's going on in Paul's life. I haven't read his book. Just from the cover of his book and from what I know of some of his stories, he has some scars from living in the church. I don't think anyone who has lived in the church a long time, and especially has had leadership positions in the church, will leave without scars. Human beings are the most dangerous creature on the planet in many respects, and churches are places where they're not terribly safe places in many ways. And oops, got to turn down your there you go. Churches are not terribly safe spaces, and neither are therapists' office. I spent, over the last few weeks, I've spent a fair amount of time in a dentist chair. The dentist office is not a safe space, but it's a good space. And that dentist goes into my mouth with drills and chemicals and all kinds of crazy stuff in order to bring some degree of repair to my mouth. as a response to decay. So when I work with people one-on-one, or I have a personal relationship with someone, or I engage them, and I even try to do this over the internet, often with more failure, because quite understandably people might look at me and say, I can't trust you. Fair enough. They don't really know me. Why would they think they can trust me? Why would they imagine that in one way or another I want the best for them, and at the same time I fully acknowledge that I don't know everything, especially about them or about everything. So it's, to me, sort of an application of the Pascal's spirit of finesse. So when someone deconstructs, I want to approach them with the spirit of finesse. Now, sometimes to get their attention, I'll give them a little poke. And sometimes you give them a little poke and they won't respond. And so, okay, I'll poke a little harder. And then they'll get a little, they'll say, ouch! Okay, well, now I have your attention. Well, calm down a little bit and let's talk. And let's take some of these things and put it out on the table. And maybe I can help you sort through some things. And maybe you will, or maybe you won't reappropriate an identity and re-enter a communion. But as part of the process, I'd like us to at least act with honesty and with fairness between each other, and see if maybe you and I can come to some mutual agreement of what progress looks like. And so, in Paul Maxwell's case, he's got no shortage of Christians in his life, and I am by no means a close relationship of him. But if I could in any way be helpful to him, I'd be happy to be so, at least within the constraints of the number of people around me that would like me to be helpful for them as well. And so it's all of that managing that goes on in something like this. So I pray for his welfare, and as a Christian minister, I certainly would love to see him once again embrace the identity of Christian and embrace the communion of the saints, which is the church. But for whatever reason right now, he sees stepping away as an important and a healthy thing for him. And so again, if he wants this, and if it seems appropriate that we do some of this work together, maybe we will. And I think that's how, in my experience, again, people often say, well, Paul, you're very different from other pastors. And I don't really think so, because I know many other pastors who feel like I do with respect to this stuff. Now, there are some that don't, and I get that. And I think there are actually important reasons why pastors take different takes on these things. There needs to be room for both the therapeutic and the antithetical. Both of those things are real, and so they both deserve expression in reality. But what I just laid out with respect to a situation like Paul Maxwell is sort of my modus operandi in the world, and that comes through in my channel. And sometimes people will say, well, you need to talk to more evangelicals, or more whatever kind of Christian the person thinks I should talk to more of, because, and I usually look at that and say, it's more interesting for me to talk to people who actually aren't Christian. Not because I don't love Christians, but because I'm just trying to share a good thing. And part of me is an evangelist. And so on one hand, I've got this weird Calvinism that says, I can't make you a Christian. Only God can do that. And on the other hand, another part of me wants to engage in God's process. And so if I can be helpful in any way, I want to be available for that, because I find it really exciting to watch God work in people's lives to bring healing and restoration and wholeness. And I also know that God's ways are not our ways. And even if you read the Bible, God takes risks and does things in people's lives that we look at sometimes with awe and sometimes with shock and horror. Why would God use, I think of the book, oh, what is it now? Shoot. Un, Unbroken. Is it Louis Zeffirelli? Was that his name? It's a great book by Laura Hildebrand. I think that's the name of the author, who, this guy, he's a world-class sprinter. He's a world-class athlete. Then he goes into World War II, and he winds up, him and another guy, setting a record for, life in the open sea, something that no record any of us would ever want to set. And then he gets rescued by the Japanese and brought to the most sadistic Japanese prison camp and is tortured for the remainder of the war. And finally, at the end of the war, goes back to North America, to New York City, and meets the woman of his dreams. And you would think, oh, end the movie there. It's all wonderful. But he winds up basically destroying his life with alcoholism, which, again, if you understand anything about trauma, makes perfect sense. The man had undergone insane trauma, and then he goes to a Billy Graham crusade, becomes a Christian. And again, I don't recommend, if people have an alcohol problem, I'll usually recommend a 12-step program or, some of the usual therapeutic ways of addressing alcoholism. But he goes to a Billy Graham crusade and gets saved and no longer has a problem with alcohol and spends the rest of his life helping boys and young men as a mentor. It's an astounding story. And does the story justify the awful tortures that he endured to set up the story? We look at that and say, well, come on, Lord, can't you use less dramatic measures in our lives? So I released the conversation that I did with J.P. Marceau and John Vervaeke, which I thought was an astounding conversation. And just yesterday, Andrea and Jonathan Peugeot and I recorded a conversation. It'll probably come out next week or so if Andrea's got the recording and she's got to edit it and such. So hopefully it all worked out technically for her. But and so John Vervaeke in our next conversation with JP, so many JPs, with JP and John and I, wants to talk about the problem of evil. And boy, I go into a conversation like that with fear and trembling on one hand, because I can't answer these questions. It sort of sets up the end of the book of Job, where God comes in his glory and his terror and says, "What now, little man?" And, I think Job's answer, "I place my hand over my mouth," is about the best answer you can give. But God shows up on Golgotha, which, as we talked about in the Peugeot conversation, is the kind of story you just can't seem to get around or best. So, whatever God is doing in Paul Maxwell's life, God is doing. And God will do it for God's glory. One of the hardest things for we human beings to get to deal with is that we are secondary and God is primary, and it can be no other way. Now, for each of us as individuals, we're sort of primary to ourselves, but the heart of Christian conversion is, in some ways, the prayer of Jesus at Gethsemane, "Not my will, but yours be done." And the prayer of Christ on the cross, "Into your hands, I release my spirit." And that's the heart of the gospel. And so we present ourselves as living sacrifices, holy and acceptable. Romans 12. And to me, that makes the most sense of the world and can square both the reality of the image of God in us and the reality of the cruciform path of Israel in the Old Covenant and Christ in the new. So that's what I have to say about that. Doing my best, Forrest Gump. Second question, the prodigal son. And it's kind of a long question about Ram Dass. And I don't know anything about the guy. So, there's some links in, or there's some, I just reread the biography of Ram Dass and saw his documentary in San Rafael called Becoming Nobody, and his story seems eerily similar to Peterson in some important ways. He told a story of his guru, the Maharaji, an Indian Hindu saint, who told his Western devotees, many secular Jewish men and women who were not Christians nor religious, or who later would become New Age teachers and Zen monks, to meditate like Christ, because Westerners, though Jewish, Christ was their guru in his words. This blew them away. When they asked how to do this, he began to weep. What do you make of that? C.S. Lewis did the foreword to D. Harding's Heaven and Earth. Ram Dass did the foreword of his little book of life and death. That's really interesting. So I'm going to have to look up some of these people and things because I don't know anything about them. But I would point to the conversation with J.P. Marceau and John Vervaeke to get some of my thinking about. I don't think the world is actually saved, and this is going to come out in my sermon this Sunday, so the rough draft comes out tomorrow. And this, it's very interesting because I thought of this, and so I talked to Mark, and Mark said, I write these big meaty comments on your videos, and you just give me a little heart. So I'm trying to write Mark a little better comments on his meaty YouTube video comments to me. But when I was thinking about this today, I was thinking about the fact that when guys like Steven Pinker or Sam Harris talk about the glory of the Enlightenment, in many ways, I'll think about, someone, let's say, if they're talking in an Eastern religious meditative context, they talk about enlightenment. Now, the same word gets used for this, the rise of modern, Western, scientific view from nowhere, monarchical vision, all of that modernity stuff. We call that enlightenment. But the proof of that enlightenment, and I think this again betrays its Christian roots, the proof of that enlightenment is the material, technological benefits to people in the West. And I think that's saying something really important. I've just got to shut off the I think that's saying something really important, which is similar to the point I was making in that video, that we will not be satisfied until Christ is all in all. And I talked about that in the Peugeot Andrea conversation too. We will not be satisfied until Christ is all in all. We will not be satisfied until every rebellion is laid to rest and resolved. Okay. And I think it's important to understand that. So, and I think it's for the same reason that let's say we develop the perfect, most addictive video game you can imagine. And that's exactly the goal of how many billion-dollar industry of the video game manufacturers. They want to create the most addictive, the most meaningful, the most immersive, the most all-consuming video game anyone could imagine. And so they're leveraging archetypal stories and images and all of that in order to finally fully engross not only one human mind, but whole human communities. That is the goal of the video game industry. Now, no, I'm not saying that to slam them. That's the goal of every novelist. That's the goal of every preacher. That's the goal of everything. I mean, in some ways, the entire drama of planet Earth is an attempt to finally triumph over humanity itself and all our diverse destructive appetites, and to do so in a final, fulfilling way. That's the goal of everything. And So video games want to do that, and video games are very powerful. Movies are very powerful. Television series are very powerful. In some ways, the streaming revolution is sort of the next iteration of movies, because a streamed episode, think of Breaking Bad, which is an amazing story, goes 5 series. How many episodes? The goal of all of this is to finally engross and satisfy us fully and completely. But a streamed television series or a video game or even a piece of art that you can stand in front of in a world-class museum and get lost within for hours, or a novel that within which we can get lost for hours, or a fandom, or the Harry Potter universe or the Marvel universe. I mean, that's the goal of all of this stuff, to finally satisfy and fulfill us forever. As long as those things are on a screen or between our ears, they are insufficient. We want all of the world to be what's called the consummation theologically. We want all of the world to be consumed. And this is where actually I think we see the root of Christianity, where that we as human beings want to finally be ravished. We are the feminine. The Church of Jesus Christ is the bride of Christ. We want to finally be fully consumed by the specific pleasure of the inferior, as C.S. Lewis says in his sermon, The Weight of Glory. We want to finally be ravished and beloved and enraptured by the masculine God that both possesses us, fills us, elevates us by his love. This is what we desire. And even cocaine or video games or music and art, all of these things lean in towards that. But the consummation that Christ will finally complete will be inclusive of everything. And that raises the question of hell. Is there a remainder? And I'll leave that aside for now. But that's the vision of a new heavens and a new earth, of the universe redeemed and restored. That's what this is all about. And we see that desire all over the place. So, all right, I've rambled for about a half hour. Anybody want to follow up on any of that, or questions from the voice chat? And whenever I hear no sounds from the room, I always panic, because I think I've lost connection and I'm talking to myself, or maybe just me and Rick.
Hey, Paul, you were talking about that guy who went to the Billy Graham crusade and then suddenly kicked his long-standing addiction.
Yep.
That just made me think my wife and I just watched The Sound of Metal. I don't know if you've seen that movie.
No, I haven't.
It's like an Oscar best film contender about this guy who is a heavy metal drummer and loses his hearing. But one of the primary devices in the film is that he's this addict, cocaine and all manner of other things. And I thought it was like the most unbelievable thing in the movie that kind of took me out of it was he goes to this sort of deaf AA place, but there's like no evidence that he's struggling with his physical chemical addiction. And I think part of that is because they're trying to use it as kind of a metaphor for his relationship with this woman. But nevertheless, I was like, oh, you can't just get off of an addiction like that. But maybe you can.
It happens. Yeah, I've known people that It's happened, and we sort of look at that as miraculous, and rightfully so. But it does happen, and I think you raise with that the interesting relationship. So again, I use Vervaeke's reciprocal narrowing and reciprocal broadening language. And I think that's helpful because an addiction is in some ways, and Peugeot and I talk about this in our conversation with Andrea, addiction is in some ways kind of the mirror reverse of theosis, glorification, divinization, whichever kind of language you want to use, because it's you become the problem with addiction is you become a slave to a lesser master. The glory of redemption is we become a slave to the greatest master, and in a sense, okay, so let's use the slavery analogy. If there's some jerk down the road who has a slave and he's a jerk and a small man, your master, the master becomes the limitation of the slave. And so the slave will never be above the master. And so if you're a slave of an abusive, manipulative small man with his tiny vices and his tiny world, the slave will be always within and beneath that tiny man and his tiny world. If you're the slave of the master of all things, who is overflowing with love and who has all power, then there's your limit. Your limit is infinite. And that's reciprocal broadening. And so once the video comes out, and Peugeot says it very nicely, if you are the slave of the great master, he didn't say this exactly, I'm riffing on it, but then suddenly everything is, the world opens up. And my own language for this is, if you love God, your agency increases and it's reciprocal broadening. If you are the slave to some petty little god or idol, then it is reciprocal narrowing. So that's why, I don't want to get into a labels contest here, but this is why I'm a Christian, because I look around and I don't find anything better. I look at Christianity and I say, this is the best I can see, and every time I really push it, it's better than I can imagine. And that's why I'm a Christian. And I'm not always I don't always, I fail my master regularly, but that's why I'm a Christian. All right, NT. Hello, Paul. First, thank you for your insights and perspectives. I've thoroughly enjoyed listening to your Bridges of Meaning discussions. Recently, the show Vikings was mentioned in your YouTube channel, Bridges of Meaning Q&A. What are your initial thoughts on the show? I had, Rationality Rules had a little clip, which I found kind of interesting, and someone said, oh, that was from Vikings, so that kind of put it into my head. And I'd seen it advertised, so that kind of put it into my head. And then, most of the time I watch TV, I am watching TV with my family members, and if I pick what's on the program, if I pick what's on the TV, I usually watch alone. They're not interested in my TV. So most of the time, I just hand over the remote and say, well, watch whatever you want to watch. And so I'll watch with them. And I'll learn stuff because it's not necessarily my viewing habits. But, every now and then everyone will go to bed, or, when my wife had this, COVID scare, I had a little extra time. And so I picked up Vikings and I started watching it. And I was immediately blown away at, compared to almost all the other secular products out in the market, this show seemed to take at least certain aspects of religion seriously. It actually attempted, faithful or not, to portray characters as religious people. And I thought some of the contrasts between so it's a collision of cultures, and the Athelstan character who was kidnapped by the Vikings and develops a really interesting relationship with Ragnar Rothbrok. I just found that to be a very interesting. I found him to be an interesting character as he sort of wrestled between the Christian God and Odin, and he was comparing and contrasting the two societies, and sometimes he'd get asked questions. I thought it was well done, and I really enjoyed it. Now I'm through season 4, and as is almost always the case with these things, the more seasons they do, the less good it gets. Well, we'll see. We'll see. Breaking Bad managed to do pretty well with that. But I've been thinking a lot more about The Boys, the Amazon series, and the first season I thought was, boy, it's crass and it's profane and it's brutal, but they're playing with some rather profound ideas that can be really interestingly applied homiletically. And so I'm kind of thinking about some of those issues I was this morning. The second season looked less than. So, and the critical drinker agrees with me. Um, Name for a channel. Rick is clapping. Rick introduced me to the critical drinker, so Rick introduces me to a lot. So, um, Ragnar Rothbrok, interesting character. I thought it was very interesting in season 4. And there's going to be some spoilers here. So, when he sort of develops a drug problem, I thought that was fascinating in the way that they handled it, and I thought it's also fascinating the development of the relationship between him and his brother Rollo. So I've generally liked it, and it's of course I'm a fantasy guy, and so the protection of Paris and the walls and the medieval warfare. I mean, that stuff is always interesting to me. So I've been enjoying it. Um, yeah, the archetypal logos through his character. Yeah, and Ragnar is an interesting guy because yeah, I've enjoyed the series. I've enjoyed the series. So I don't know much more to say about that. All right, Richard. I'll get a few more questions. Is there something right about is there something right about something like an anti-natalist movement? Well, the logic of anti-natalism is I'm going to get into this with the violence question too. To live is to suffer. Okay? You don't need to be a Christian to realize that. And I think John Vervaeke in his Awakening from the Meaning Crisis series sort of nicely pushed back on life is suffering. No, life isn't just suffering. Life is sometimes glorious, often painful. But I think part of every culture rebels against God in its own way. And part of the legacy of Christianity has been a sensitivity to suffering, which is a good thing. But if you look at what allergic reactions are, the allergic reactions are hypersensitivity to things. And so we've seen with, let's say, peanut allergies. It's the moms who, well, was that a sexist comment? Maybe the dads too. It's the parents who don't want to give their kid peanut butter that wind up setting up the peanut allergies. Our culture has developed an allergic reaction to suffering. And this is part of what's been manifest in this whole Peterson movement, where a bunch of people have said, look, you're not actually helping people by setting up these safe spaces and realms that are allergic to suffering. You need a certain amount of suffering in order to flourish and have glory in this world. The good parent figures out the right amount of suffering for their children. Now, too much suffering and it's abuse. Too little suffering, well, it's kind of abuse too, because you're setting up their allergy. So the anti-natalists sort of have a point, and human life is full of a lot of really difficult exchanges. Now, let's take one of my favorite books, The Alchemy of Air. I knew nothing about the fixation of nitrogen, the nitrogen cycle, the role that the fixation of nitrogen has played in 20th century history until I read this really wonderful little book, The Alchemy of Air. And basically, at the beginning of the 20th century, humanity was sort of hitting a population ceiling. And it was manifest in Germany. Germany is a very interesting country because, on one hand, it's population rich and land poor. Unlike, let's say, the United States that has this vast breadbasket in the middle, and then another astoundingly productive breadbasket way on the west coast called the Central Valley of California that grows 1/4 of America's food production, which is an astounding number for such a limited space. Germany is not agriculturally rich. Well, so at the beginning of that sort of sets up the World War I and World War II, because at the beginning of the 20th century, everyone in the world is trying to figure out how to deal with depleted soils. And so they had discovered, this island off the coast of South America, which was full of thousands of years of guano, and they were mining that for the nitrogen that could be used for fertilizer, yada, 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 and that even set up a war in South America. But what they needed was a source of nitrogen that could be infused into the soil to replenish soils and give crop yields. And the irony of our situation is that the air is full of nitrogen. And until this process, which was developed, it's talked about in The Alchemy of Air, the book, we had no idea how to get nitrogen out of the air and into the soil. You could do it with beans and with certain plants could do it, but that process is so slow. And you had crop rotation and, leaving fields fallow for a year. You had all of these processes to try to deal with it. Well, before the fixation of nitrogen from the air, the only way, some calculations are that the world could have a carrying capacity in terms of the amount of food that the planet can produce of somewhere between 3.5 and 4 billion people. Now, anybody who understands what has happened to population in the 20th and 21st century knows, boy, we blew that number away. The only reason we blew that number away was because of nitrogen fertilizer. But there were two motivations for the fixation of nitrogen. One was fertilizer, and the other was, what else we use nitrogen for? Explosives. And the same Jewish chemist that was partly responsible for the process of fixing nitrogen from the air also developed the cyclone gas, which, again, ironically, a few decades later, would be the gas used by the Nazis to exterminate the Jews. And this amazing capacity to pull nitrogen from the atmosphere and put it into the soil has also completely distorted the nitrogen cycle, which is a pretty important cycle. And that's why every now and then you see these satellite pictures of, wow, all of the waterways of the world are green. Well, why are they green? They're green because there's algae blooms. Well, where's the algae coming from? The algae's coming from the nitrogen-rich fertilizer that's washing off farmland. On and on and on and on and on and on we go. So the anti-natalists basically say, hey, if you don't bring in a child, that's one child less who will suffer. Yeah. It's also one child less who will experience joy and glory and bear the image of God. And so there's all these trade-offs in our world. It's just the way it is. Richard goes on, the reason I ask is because I've been gradually confronting in a more direct manner the idea of hell. You know the typical objection, humans are really deserving of eternal damnation, as to even necessitate a savior. This is one of those questions that has been stalking me for a while, and I think a good way to attack it might be to consider positions like anti-natalism, which say that human beings are somewhat fundamentally flawed and deserving of some sort of major punishment. This could be a chance for me to better understand total depravity, because of my understanding of the 5 points is very limited. I think you're barking up a fruitful tree, Richard, because there are all of these. So even Calvinists talk about total depravity, but total depravity does not mean we are all as broken as we could be. It's pervasive, okay? It's not, it's broad. It's not simply deep. Sometimes it's deep and broad, but the point of total depravity is that it's broad, in that everything I do is tainted by sin. That doesn't mean that everything is finally and fully corrupted by sin. And so all of this language about deserving damnation, what's been interesting, again, in this article, the strange persistence of guilt that I've read in some of my videos and talked about. It's very much worth looking up in the Hedgehog Review. What has happened in the whole anti-natalist movement is that it has, in fact, in some ways, become yet another alternative Calvinist version of a religion, which wokeism is. I mean, wokeism is in some ways a strange revision of Calvinism. It just is. I mean, when I began to watch wokeism arising, I thought, oh, I recognize this. This is just another version of Calvinism. And so people look at this and say, see, it's all from that terrible root. Well, Calvinism, I'm not always sure. And every now and then I still get reliable comments about how I'm not a Calvinist. Okay, well, label me how you want. I don't really care. But was Calvin a Calvinist? Read Richard Mueller's essay on that. But yeah, no, you're barking up a fruitful tree. As clarification, I'm more curious about the shared essence between Christian doctrine and things like anti-natalism as opposed to the differences. I feel that a focus on that would be more helpful in addressing the problem, and I think you're right, but perhaps not. No, I think you're right. I ultimately have faith in wherever your answer takes you. Thank you, Paul. You're welcome. Now keep it, and I think you're right, because Calvinism is deep within American culture. How could it not be, given the Puritans and the Pilgrims? And in some ways, the religion of America is New England transcendentalism, which also has Calvinist roots. So, and Calvinism and Catholicism are not always that far apart from each other, because they both go back to Augustine. And so if you really want to look at some of the interesting conversations between East and West, you can look at some of the stuff that Nathan Jacobs was doing on Augustine, because there's some differences between, let's say, Latin and Greek. So there's a lot going on there. So it's a fruitful tree to bark up. All right. Is it going to be any easier not to sin in the world to come? That's the promise. And that's our hope. And if you believe Jesus, and I think about this actually fairly often, because so much of potentiality for us involves chaos. And so then you look at the book of Revelation and there isn't any sea, which is saying something about chaos. So I don't know how God's going to do what God's going to do. And we bump into those kind of questions when we watch The Good Place or Upload, some of these attempts to envision a perfect world. It's really hard for us. That's because we're small, dim, limited creatures, but also glorious and brilliant, and we're all those things too. And that's, what is the measure of a man? We're astounding creatures. You've made us a little lower than the angels. Sometimes we're tremendously tragic, and sometimes we're gloriously brilliant. Human beings are amazing. So I think in the world to come, we will be glorified. But what Christ has in store for us there, he knows. I don't. I trust him. It's the specific pleasure of the inferior. Okay, Chad. Could it be that I'm simply overthinking everything and I'm bent on chasing my own tail? I'm sure it could be. It's not an uncommon thing for a human being. Well, it's a variation of what I was experiencing yesterday morning and much of my life, experience of unnamed existential angst. Here's a funny thing about us, and I find this with people all the time. Some people are worriers, and this sort of gets into Jordan Peterson's personality, the big five personality thing. Some people who are high in anxiety, they're worriers. So what do they do with their eyes? They look for reasons to worry. And I noted, or some people are angry, and they look for things to be angry about. And some people are, as Jonathan Haidt notes, they've won the cortical lottery, and they're just really happy people. And so they look for things to be happy about. So if you look at Peugeot's focus on attention in his conversation with Peterson, yeah, in some ways, what you pay attention to makes your world. This is one of Peterson's big points. And Peterson says, if you want to change your life, change what you pay attention to. Now, that's against the backdrop of your personality profile, which will bend you towards some things and bend you towards another. I am a lottery winner of the cortical lottery in many ways. I tend to be quite happy and fairly positive. And so I often see the good in people and things. And some of my friends, I think I'll include Jacob in that. He says, you don't see what's going on beneath. There's darker things happening. And part of me says, I'm sure there are, but I'm going to sort of focus on the redemptive. So that makes human beings in community very interesting creatures, because sometimes I'll get duped and sometimes I'm wrong, and sometimes I'll give people enough rope to hang themselves when if I was a little less generous with the rope, they wouldn't have hanged themselves. So there's all these kind of choices. How do I get over that lack of faith? Well, if it's temperamental, it will probably always be something you struggle with. But there's an upside to that. I'm an optimist. I see upsides. There's an upside to that. So if you look throughout history at great Christian saints who were strugglers, well, I'll pick this book by James Scott, Reading Mother Teresa. And I actually have a blurb on the back, a little blurb that I wrote for him in his book. And a Calvinist looks lovingly at the little bride of Christ. And what this little book about Mother Teresa identifies is how she struggled. Because for some people, Chariots of Fire, Eric Liddell, God made me fast. When I run, I feel God's pleasure. This little woman never felt his pleasure. If you had asked her, she probably would have said she was reprobate. She was damned for all eternity. And yet she loved him still by trying to love the lowest and the least of the world. The world is full of this stuff. And so if you struggle with faith, you may in fact have greater faith than someone like me who doesn't struggle with it too much, because you have something to overcome. Look at the person who is bound in a wheelchair and has to constantly move themselves around the world or wheel this wheelchair. They usually have tremendous shoulders. They have tremendous shoulders because they have no legs. Well, maybe God's building up your shoulders by the temperamental mix that you have. And you'll always be a struggler. And is it fair? No. Would everybody like to have the cortical makeup that I have? Probably. I look at people who are bent to depression and misery and anxiety, and I'm like, boy, it sucks to be them. Glad to be me. But if the world was full of happy people like me, it'd probably be a disaster. So this is what's kept me away from Christianity. And this is part of the reason, to go back to my first question and answer about Paul Maxwell, I hold labels rather loosely. And in fact, the Bible does this because Jesus basically says, hey, look, y'all have labels on everybody about who's in and who's out. Some of the least will be the greatest. Some of the greatest will be the least. When there's the triumphal procession into the Feast of the Patriarchs, you're going to be very surprised. And in fact, probably some of the people themselves will be surprised at who God, in the summating pageantry of this dispensation, holds up and says, look at these saints. They didn't feel it. But at great cost to themselves, they soldiered faithfully in the world and represented me. And maybe Vanderklay says, gosh, it was easy for Vanderklay to believe. Look at the personality profile I gave him. He's low in anxiety. He's moderate in agreeableness. He's high in openness. It's easy for Vanderklay to be a Christian. It's not easy for you. So then who gets the reward? So I'd say keep struggling and let God build those shoulders. And, it doesn't help probably because of how you're wired. But the terror and fear of knowing that I surely not live up to my expectations or perceptions of God's demands. Again, maybe you should read this book, Reading Mother Teresa, because everybody looked at her like, oh wow, what a great saint. If you asked her, she'd say, I'm not a saint. I can't feel his pleasure and his glory. I just feel his judgment. But I'm going to go into the streets of Calcutta and I'm going to at least give a little bit of relief to the people that the world treats like garbage. And some of them probably deserve it. But, and this again is why, in my Calvinism, the sin of Calvinism is sometimes we don't fully acknowledge the capacity of human volition. But the glory of Calvinism is that we have an appreciation for the fact that each of us has been dealt a certain number of limited cards. And we, one way or another, try to give glory to God out of gratitude for the cards that we've been dealt. And if you've been dealt good cards, happy are you. But I'm not sure your reward will be greater. If you've been dealt hard cards, tough on you. But maybe out of this tiny little dispensation that we live now, your reward for ages to come will be that much more. And Jesus says so many of these upside down things in the Gospels. The Sermon on the Plain, woe to you who are rich, but blessed are you who are poor. And so Jesus keeps talking about this upside down kingdom. So I just want to encourage you in your suffering that in your wheelchair, you might not have any legs, but if you serve God here and now, you can create an upper body that will go into eternity. So, all right. Colton. Hello, Paul. Hello, Colton. Oh, you're in the room too. Good. I've got a question about violence, particularly as it is portrayed in video games. Ooh, this is a long question. Though all forms of entertainment apply, the age-old argument from Christians has been violent video games causes violent kids. I don't know that that's a Christian argument. I think that's an argument that's just sort of out there. And my understanding is that the argument has been proven wrong, that violent games doesn't produce violent kids. Um, and I'm not saying that that kids should be immersed in violent representations and imagery all the time, but it's sort of a facile, maybe common sense idea that kids just do what they see. And here's a funny thing. I'd say in many ways our culture is a good bit less violent than previous cultures. And I would imagine seeing physical violence in front of you that is consequential. And there's plenty that goes on now. You know, imagine you grow up in a house where there's domestic violence. I would imagine the violence that people see on screens is categorically different than watching one parent beat the tar out of another. And I would imagine any therapist in the room would back me up on that. Anyway, but that isn't the angle I want to take. Oops. As a child, I played hundreds or thousands of hours of violent video games, and I never once had an inclination to harm another human being because of it. I think your experience is the norm. They may have taught me more to be crude and lazy. I think you're right, but not violent. I don't want to examine the psychological effects, though they could exist. I'd rather examine the righteousness of the act. Well, this is interesting. Do playing violent video games really glorify God? Probably not a lot. One example, when I find violence acceptable in a movie like Saving Private Ryan, where the intent is to horrify you, but oftentimes video games violence is looked on as, whoa, this is so cool, how realistic, how gnarly. Yeah. Violence as realism seems perhaps plausible, since many people associate the better games, the better video game experiences with more graphically realistic games. However, is it really edifying to God? Am I playing these games for his glory or my pleasure? If the game is a compelling story which broadens your morality, theology, and we deal with this with movies. So I just mentioned The Boys, which when I was watching it for the first time, I've heard people make this comment about Game of Thrones. I think it was Nathan Jacobs who made this comment about it. He says, I'm not old enough to watch this. And when I was watching The Boys, it's like, I don't know if and as a pastor to a degree, I know therapists have the same thing. And I guess part of my answer to this is to contrast representations of violence that are on images and screens in front of us, which have impact, but we all have these brains, which, with the exaptation of our powerful visual, we have incredible eyes as compared to many animals. And our incredible ability of our eyes is all created by all of this brain power that's used of the eyes. And then when I close my eyes, I can do all sorts of things visually in my mind, that exaptation of all of that high horsepower processing. So I don't want to either fail to appreciate the significance of represented violence on screens, but also not overplay it. Is it glorifying to God? I'd say depends how it's used. Perhaps violence is like crude language and behavior, which we indulge in because we are sinners. Well, meganoita, Paul says in the New Testament. He says that those in the book of Galatians, he says those who are promoting circumcision among the Gentiles should go all the way and castrate themselves. That's what he says. Basically, it's hell no in Greek. So, This is where I get into, again, the answer that I was talking about before, that God does things that we look at him and think he shouldn't do that, but he does. Now, on one hand, we can say, well, only God has the license to do that. And that's right. But we have to understand sort of our place and our limitation. I don't know. I don't know, Colton, if I actually did any justice to your question. So if you want to follow up right now, I see you're in the room.
Yeah, I'll add just a little bit. I think that you approached it pretty honestly, but you actually did skip over one sentence that I think is kind of a neat idea, or maybe a good justification if you can find one. Um, I think that even though video game violence and movie violence are like kind of the same thing, I think that like when people say, "Oh, kids can't play violent video games," they're basically saying kids can't watch like violent movies either, which people do all the time. And it's so like I think those two are a lot more close than people like on that side of the aisle would like to admit. So like I like Clint Eastwood, but I don't want my kid to play, like Call of Duty. It's like it's kind of the same thing,
Yeah.
But but I do think that there is a little bit of a difference in actually acting out the thing in the game. I think there's a slight difference, and then I make the point. I say if the game is serving as a spiritual metaphor as of good versus evil, where the player is defeating evil with his virtual sword and armor, perhaps that glorifies God because you're sort of acting out, this like spiritual warfare in a video game setting. So maybe you can comment on that.
Yeah. And I think that gets into the use of the word gratuitous. And the same thing goes with displays of sexuality or graphic nudity, things of this nature. And we use that word gratuitous in is the display of sex and violence what is the clear artistic intent behind the display? And it all calls for discernment and judgment, both of the artist who is creating the representation and the viewer who is participating in it. So, and you're absolutely appropriate to limit children with respect to these things. Yet, anybody who deals with adults and their dirty little secrets knows that children get subjected to violence themselves and witness violence. And you think, again, we live in such a weird time as compared to almost the rest of human history, because even if you were raised on a farm or a family that hunts, you understand, in some ways, you have a better understanding of life and death and violence and sex than the strange citified life that we are raising people in now. If you understood that bacon comes from the hog that you butchered, or the food on the table comes from the game that you shot and dressed and preserved, or that you're all living. So I worked with Haitians, so check that off on the bingo. You've got a household of, one pastor I knew, he had, I don't know how many kids he had, 14, 16, 18 kids. And the house that he was living in with a good number of these kids was pretty big in terms of their huts, but it was maybe 10 by 20 with maybe some little partitions. You can't believe that how many of those kids didn't catch their parents having sex if they had that many kids over that many years. And if you grew up on a farm, you had a pretty good understanding about the physics of sex, because here's the bull, here's the cow, here's the ram, here's the lamb. It's all there. And now we create these weird societies where it's all kind of hidden. Then you have stories of people who were raised in brothels, and I mean, it's just so sheltering people from sex and violence. Yeah. Why expose children to this imagery when you don't have to? Yeah, throughout human history, children have seen plenty. And I'm not saying it's a good thing, but it's just a true thing. Oh, you guys added more questions. Oh my goodness, you people. All right. CW. Do you believe, as Ventil did, that there is an intellectual challenge to the gospel? Something about Christianity which represents an implicit or explicit intellectual insight or critique which challenges alternative realities? I would say absolutely, because that's the nature of what intellectual means. Intellectual is sort of an abstraction from, a certain layer of reality. And if things are in competition down here, they'll probably be in competition up here. And the use of the intellectual, our ideas die so that we don't have to, as Jordan Peterson says. So absolutely, there's going to be layers of that are fighting each other. If so, how would you characterize that challenge? Exactly what I just did. So, even just the question we were just dealing with respect to violence, well, we sort of abstract it. And in fact, all these representations that we have in movies and video games are in some ways abstractions from them. So again, I've been thinking about The Boys because I've been thinking about superhero stories, and The Boys is sort of a deconstruction of superhero stories. We're dealing with these representations in order to understand the way things work in the full-blown physical world. And again, to go back to my earlier questions, the goal is that the physical world can be redeemed. And so it's all one thing, which is, I think, why the Gnostics are wrong. Because the Gnostics basically say it's all up here and this is all the stuff up high is the true. I understand where you get that from Platonism. And the materiality is derivative because it's subject to decay. Now, it's a very old and powerful observation by the Greeks, but Christianity comes along in the resurrection of Jesus Christ and says, is decay essential to materiality? And in some ways, Christianity is grappling with certain articles of physics, especially with respect to entropy. So that's kind of the role of the intellectual. We deal with things abstractly in order to apply them concretely. Mark Lefebvre, in your talk with JP and John Vervaeke, you talked about the difference between material and ethereal and the bridging of that gap. John seems to think that enlightenment is possible without Christianity, but I see this insufficient in some sense. Can you talk about how the church bridges that gap? Perhaps contrasting then versus now in terms of church history. So today's video that I released this morning is all about the church's failure to bridge that gap. People come to church, and in some ways, the church dishes out the most audacious promises that here in this place, in this community, among this people, you will begin to experience the life of the age to come. And then the pastor has eyes for the organist, or maybe keeps his hands off the teenage girls in the youth group. And Ravi takes the success that he has in promoting the Christian mission and puts his money into massage parlors. The point of the church, in some ways, is to give physical manifestation to the words of Christ, the Logos. And as Nietzsche via Peterson noted, in all fairness, you could really say there's only one Christian. And he was the guy up on the cross and the guy who walked out of the tomb. Fair enough. The church is a poor witness, as Jordan Peterson notes. He's unimpressed. Fair enough. But we all fall short. So, yeah, the idea of the church is to bring material realization of the Logos into the world. But, see, and that's true of the woke church as well. And that's why, wokeism is a heresy. It's not non-Christian. It's just heretical. And there's almost always some heresy about. So that gap is what Christianity tries to address in the church. But this is where the canonical gospels are really important, because part of what the canonical gospels address, and this is in some ways some of my little ongoing debate between me and Jacob here in terms of the definition of Messiah, is that I think part of what Jesus shows us in the gospel is that within this dispensation, the manifestation of the Logos will always have at least an aspect, and sometimes an enormous element, of the cruciform. And that's why Jesus said, they will hate you like they hated me. Because in some ways, the age of decay is insufficient to fully represent the life of God. That's what Christianity says in the brokenness and the fallenness of this world. And that's why the flesh of Jesus Christ that he has after his creation, his resurrected body, is in some ways doesn't quite fit in this world. He makes this really interesting demand of Mary when she sees him in the Gospel of John, and he says, don't cling to me because I have not yet ascended to my Father. What? At the same time you got Thomas poking at your hands and you're eating a fish? What's going on with that? And I think it has to do with, so Jesus does things like the miracles, and he multiplies loaves and fishes, and those miracles are, they're not just, oh look, I'm breaking the supernatural barrier. No, he's not playing cheap tricks like that. All of those miracles are, he is giving windows into the new creation from the old creation. And Lewis points this out in his book Miracles. That these miracles are parables in material form. Now, when we see them, our hearts try to appropriate them via our sin. So, oh good, we'll make bread tomorrow. No, you're not getting the point. Oh good, you filled our fishing nets tonight without any exertion from us, so fill them again tomorrow. No, Jesus is not a shill of the prosperity gospel. The prosperity gospel is a misunderstanding of the relationship between Logos and the age of decay. So the church lives in the middle of that. And that's why at some times the church can be glorious and beautiful, and other times can be corrupt and ghastly. And ironically, it's sometimes, and one author who really tried to explore this was Frederick Buechner. He wrote this book Lion Country, which is part of sort of a 4-part, he called it the Book of Beb, where he talks about a southern preacher who lives in some awful place in Florida, and has a diploma mill. And there's always these suspicions that he had molested someone. And so, there's sort of this reputation around him as a sexual predator, but he also raised a dead person to life once. And what Buechner does in that character of Beb, um, it's a hilarious book. But Buechner plays with this dynamic of right now in this dispensation, as a community, we are not fully able to host the Logos in its fullness. Now, it's not theoretically impossible because Jesus did it. But the story that happens around Jesus shows us what will always happen. In that Jesus managed to tick off all of the elements of his culture war. He ticked off the Romans, although they mostly didn't pay much attention to him. He ticked off all of the different factions of the Jewish liberation movement. He ticked off everyone, and he left his disciples more confused than anything else. And it wasn't until his Spirit comes on them that they slowly begin to get it, but they still don't get it perfectly. Look at Peter and Paul. So that is what the church does. The church is God's Spirit manifesting itself in imperfect people of us in the age of decay. And so, and this is my gripe with holiness movements, I just think that you're not understanding the Gospels, because right now our flesh can't really fully host it. Now, someone might come back to me and say, well, how far can it go? That's kind of Peterson's question. And I'd say, I don't know, certainly farther than me. But, and so some holiness or Pentecostals want to push the envelope, and God bless you. Go ahead, clean out that hospital. You get a miracle, and you get a miracle, and you get a miracle. I'll praise God if you do. I'm a little skeptical. Because the way that Jesus managed his miracles leads me to say that my understanding of what's happening in the Gospels is correct, in that there's a transformation coming. And even figuring out the lines of that transformation is not terribly easy. Well, what's God's part and what's our part? Yeah, well, agency is nested. So these are hard and good questions. And to talk about them is one thing, because then we're dealing with the intellectual and the theoretical. But an illustration of my point is, in fact, that all of this talk is cheap. And if you want to see, so again, there's I've got a video that the conversation partner that I had is still debating whether or not she wants to release it. The women are a lot wiser than men. They're always way more reluctant to release their videos, conversations with me. Even though sometimes I say, I think you could. I'd love you to, but it's completely up to you. I totally respect anybody who, there's really good reasons to maintain your privacy. And that's why pastors' conversations with people are like therapist conversations. They're privileged. And pastors are held to that. But in her case, she has taken a costly cruciform path that if she shares her story, and she just shared a little bit of it in this video. We had a first conversation actually that we recorded where she shared a lot more, and we didn't share that. But there are few things more powerful in this world than a Christian walking the cruciform road, than them denying themselves. And everyone around them, Christians included, says, No, 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 no. You're taking it too hard. Be fairer to yourself. And sometimes that's true. I see sometimes Christians doing really stupid, injurious things, and it's like, I don't think you're giving glory to God. You're just messing up yourself and your kids. But sometimes there are people that are, in fact, walking a cruciform path. And that's way more powerful than all of these words that we're slinging on these screens and these podcasts. Those are the things that those are the things that transform nations and peoples and bring thousands into the Christian fold. So LF Bazani, related to the Maxwell question. What are your thoughts about the celebrity dynamic as it pertains to the Christian life? Oh, yes. Glenn Scrivener interviewed the atheist lawyer behind Ravi Watch, and it was an interesting part of that conversation. We'll have to look at that. I haven't seen that. How we'll look for the champions of faith, and in essence, they are our faith. And if we fall, what is left for us to believe in? Yeah, that is a huge piece of this. And, you know, we're stuck in all of these, you know, in a lot of ways, what I'm doing right now on YouTube is dangerous and in some ways stupid because I'm no great saint. I have my sins. I have my weaknesses. And, you know, there are times that I think I'm going to say something or do something. And, you know, what does Jesus say about those who cause little ones to stumble? It'd be better for you to have a rock, you know, tied to you and thrown into the depths of the sea. And the Bible also says that those who aspire to teach will be held to a higher standard. And then when you get into celebrity culture, oh yeah, yeah. This seems to be a subtle risk, or sometimes not so subtle. And while maybe seen mostly clearly with apologists would seem to be a problem with any Bible teacher, exactly, even accountability buddies, i.e., that we become gurus. No, you're exactly right, and I'm nervous. You know, yesterday I was every now and then I think, nuts with this. I'm gonna just delete my YouTube channel. I'm gonna delete the podcast, and I'll go away. And you know, I'm gonna do a Francis Chan. I'm gonna turn and leave it all behind. And I respect Francis Chan for what he did, because in some ways, you know, becoming popular and having followers and becoming successful, isn't this what you've worked for? Well, yeah, but I watched. There was a Netflix movie that my wife was watching that I jumped in on, The Stand-In, where there's this successful actress that is just sick of the game, and so her stand-in starts to take over. It was an interesting little movie on Netflix. I thought there were some interesting points to it, but yeah, good question. Oh gosh, can I get through them all? I don't know. I got a half hour. Got 3 questions. Maybe I can. Just got to be brief. What's your take on modern media that portrays Jesus, such as The Passion of the Christ and The Chosen? I haven't seen The Chosen. Everybody's talking about how good The Chosen is, but I haven't watched it. You know, it's some of my Protestant iconoclasm, I guess, leaking through that. You know, in sermons recently, I've been using some, you know, classical portraits of, you know, Rembrandt or Caravaggio in my sermons. And every time I put pictures up like that, I think, should I be doing this? Now with Jesus, it's a little easier because Jesus was the icon of the invisible God. Colossians. But there's always pitfalls with it. And so I'm not about to say that these movies shouldn't be made or that Christians shouldn't watch them. I've certainly seen plenty of people who have testified to being helped by them. But I always sort of better appreciate when movies, even sort of like Tolkien did. I mean, in some ways, Tolkien splits up Jesus between Gandalf, Aragorn, and Frodo, partly because it's really hard to manifest the entirety of Christ in one. And Lewis tries with Aslan and had some success, certainly. But the difficulty with making a movie, so then okay, so then there are these movies that say we're only going to use what's in the Bible, and so the only words that come out of Jesus' mouth are the words that you can find in the Bible. But that's sort of like red letter Bibles, because in order to represent what's on the text on a screen, you have to use filler. And that filler has to come from somewhere. And again, that in and of itself is not a bad thing, because preachers do that all the time. We're always throwing lots of our filler into it. But there's a little bit of deception in the film that, well, this is authentic. And in that way, you're almost better off doing like a lot of Renaissance artists when they depict Jesus and these stories from the Bible in Renaissance Italy. Because at least you're upfront with your filler. And at least then you're showing that you are, in a sense, doing like a preacher does with a sermon. You're attempting to recast it in a different time and space, which is in fact the job of every Christian. So I've got this ambivalence about these kinds of movies. More specifically, what benefit and or harm does it do to our impression of Jesus by seeing film of a modern actor portraying him? Yeah, there's plenty of potential in that. Is this sort of modern day iconography that can help us connect with the human Christ? I'm sure it can. And the world is just really big. And I remember I got a lesson once when I somewhere made a derogative comment about Jim and Tammy Baker, who were sort of laughingstocks in the culture a number of decades ago. And I made that in a class at some point broader than my church, and someone came up to me and said, my parents became Christians because of Jim and Tammy Baker. Put my hand over my mouth. Learn a lesson. God does things. We look at him and say, should you really have done it that way? Then he says, you're going to edit my work? You can't even edit your own work. So I try not to be too quickly dismissive, even though that is part of my nature, and it does come through sometimes. Or does some amount of profane inevitably slip in through these portrayals and reduce our appreciation of the sacred? Yeah, when it comes to the sacred, we can't read the Bible either without putting in filler. So these issues are inevitable. So you do it, and you live with the good and the bad. So, Dave 77. Hi Paul, your convo with Vervaeke and JP. I've always been interested in comparisons of Jesus Christ to Buddha. It's fairly common with New Age types to say that Jesus Christ was simply an enlightened being. However, Buddha sinned much in his own early life, and this seems to me integral to the Enlightenment and the fundamental of his narrative, and I think that's true. Jesus is utterly without sin from before birth through life and death, right? You might also, in all fairness to Buddhism, Jesus' sinlessness, which I'm not skeptical about, it's interesting that everyone who was against Jesus in his life did not see him as sinless. And when Christians say he's sinless, Christians are in some ways saying exactly what Peterson says about Jesus to some degree, that he's our model. That's our model. Except we sin. Well, what do we mean by that? We fall short. We miss the mark. We're not true in the way that the arrow is true. Are these are clearly different narratives, also different archetypally, right? Why does this not seem to impress Vervaeke when comparing them? You'd have to ask John. um, I feel like something is being missed there. Well, we all miss stuff. Um, so at the end of the video, I asked, and it's a question I live with a lot. What, and I should apply it to me. Why do I not want Jesus to be Lord? Why do I not want God to be on the throne? Because there's a little part of me, like the dude from Dumb and Dumber, that looks at the throne and wants to be in it and says, so there's a chance. And I think pluralism is something that we continually have to deal with. And so part of what I think the Jordan Peterson movement has been about is an attempt to outflank pluralism in the same way that Enlightenment, empiricism, and rationalism was an attempt to outflank the Renaissance turn to the texts. So it makes people nervous to say things like Jesus is the only way. Because that sort of seems to bind us in this world, not always to things that we've got a degree of rebellion in our hearts that persists. And to finally lay it all down and say, I am not my own. To finally lay it all down and say, not my will but yours. To finally lay it all down and say, I am the inferior. Have your way with me. And especially when some Christians have had their way with them and not in a very Christ-like way, I can understand why they are hesitant. And hey, to say that you are a Christian doesn't mean that everything outside of that particular label is dumb or stupid or not insightful. Abram Kuyper's little thing is, there's not one square inch of this world that Christ doesn't declare, this is mine. He reaps where he did not sow. He harvests what he did not plant. So, who am I to judge these people? What's my goal? You will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, and to the ends of the earth. That's what he tells us we're to do. And he'll give us his Spirit, and it will come with power. And I think a lot of that power, in terms of the difference between the Logos and the age of decay, is a power to endure suffering. I did an adult education class for my church. I put it on YouTube too. I think it's on the church channel, where in many ways, whether you're raising a small child or being the parent of an adult child, the capacity to love is almost nearly identical for the capacity to endure and absorb suffering. That's part of the power he gives us by the Holy Spirit. So, all right. Oh, we're close. I can answer them all. And don't start dropping questions in there right now, you bunch of trolls. I'm just kidding. You can ask questions at the end if we have time. Jewish people get credit for traditional matchmaking for marriage in our popular imagination, thanks to Fiddler on the Roof. But I don't see why Christians can't give it a go. You're exactly well. Match.com or eHarmony or Christian Mingle. In fact, there was an aspect of our parallel movement of the Josh Harris purity courtship thing that was trying. And I think that's right. As a thought experiment, if the CRC Mafia gave you an offer you couldn't refuse to be in charge of the denomination's new matchmaking ministry, what would you do? Oh, only someone who is in Rod Hugin's strange version of a Christian Reformed church would dare to ask a question like that. Oh, I have no idea. But I think your point is great. And I think actually right now we are in a time when people would be open to it because there are so many people out there that are so darn frustrated and they don't know what to do. Now, I got into this a little bit in the video I released today, but a big part of this. So I was watching this God is Gray channel, and so here's this woman who's giving all this advice. You know, she doesn't have a seminary degree or authority within a church, or this is the platform thing. All you need is a Google account to go on YouTube and be a pundit. Here I am. I'm doing it. Me. Ta-da! You could meme that too. I think there'd be an openness to it for people if someone had authority. And now this is what's interesting about the science of matchmaking through the apps and through the in that business, that, well, we're going to do personality profiles. You know, you're not looking for spiritual authority for matchmaking. You're not looking for familial authority to do matchmaking. You're looking at scientific authority to do matchmaking. And what we simply reveal are the gods of our age. So I don't know if the Christian Reformed Church has authority, because authority is not only in those who profess to have it. Authority is very much in the eye of the beholder. Authority is seen from below. So, but I think it's a great idea. I think it's a great idea. Maybe the Tucson church should pick that up and run with it. You got a lot of smart people there, and I think you got a ton of wisdom in your church. And if the rest of the Christian Reformed Church would learn more from Rod Hugen, I think the denomination would be better for it. But I think it's a great idea. Oh, Josh. Look at you. Josh sneaks in a question right at the end. Dave77 is typing. Gosh. Knights and Mooks dynamics. How can Christians live counterculturally in online spaces as a gospel testimony and witness? Well, if you figure that out, tell me. I don't know. I struggle with this. I struggle with this a lot because I don't like the celebrity dynamic, but I also see it as inevitable. Jesus had to deal with celebrity. Jesus became an enormous celebrity. So I don't think celebrity per se is evil. But Jesus constantly critiqued his celebrity and sometimes undercut it directly. We talked about this in the Peugeot Andrea conversation in John 6, where Jesus says, you know, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you can have no part of me. And lots of people leave him. I mean, Jesus, the one thing Jesus isn't is captured by his audience. That's the Knights and Mooks thing. And I know anytime you say anything about Donald Trump, people respond, was Donald Trump captured by his audience? That'd be an interesting essay question. Is Biden captured by his audience? Audience capture is a real thing. And in many ways, Jesus basically said, I'm not captured by any of you. And he clearly wasn't, because nobody understood him. And they killed him. And he let them kill him. All right, Josh G. Paul, I keep hearing you invoke the category of this dispensation. Could you unfudge that for me? I'm triggered by the pre-mill, post-mill connotations. Yes, good point. Dispensation is a word that was used long before the dispensationalists did their thing in the 19th century. Dispensationalism, if you just look this up, you'll find a very well-developed framework of dispensations. What a dispensation is basically, well, think about it in monarchical terms. A king, this crazy calendar that we have, the year is 2021, Anno Domini, which of course there's a little error back there. So Jesus was born between 4 and 6 BC or BCE. But basically, a dispensation is a time period that is governed by a monarch or a power. And the Bible, unlike all of the dispensations and dispensationalism, the New Testament talks about time in terms of ages. And so there's the present evil age, which is the age of decay, and then there's the age to come. And in fact, eternal life, if you look at what English renders eternal life in your Bibles, if you look at it in Greek, it's basically life of the age. Well, what age? Life of the age to come. That's eternal life. And so that's the age to come. So you've got the present evil age, the age of decay, and you've got the age to come. And that's where you get the idea about a new age, a new dispensation. All right? So now this gets even more complex because these aren't just butting up against each other. They don't just butt up against each other, they overlap. Because the New Testament talks about the new age having begun with Christ's resurrection. So it began, but it's not fully inaugurated. It's like when normally there's an election in November and you have the president-elect, but his inauguration is in January. So you have this little time in between where there's still a president, but he's kind of a lame duck. You've got a president-elect, and his words have consequences. There's a time in between. So in the New Testament, we're sort of in that time in between. We're awaiting the consummation, the inauguration of the new age, but we're still living in the age of decay. And that sets up all kinds of tensions. And that's why, although outwardly we're wasting away, the Apostle Paul says, inwardly the age to come begins to live in us. And that's what this kind of looks like. So, yeah, that's what I mean by dispensations. And sorry for that in-house language. I should probably think of other terms that are better understood out there in the vernacular. Dave 77, follow-up. Now Job is typing. Job. Follow-up. Could you say a little more about the fact that Jesus Christ was not considered sinless in his own lifetime? I realize that he was attacked for this, but we read it as Job, stop typing. I shamed him. Politically biased. I'm not sure of the question I'll ask. You just threw me a little. Well, Jesus' enemies called him a demon. His family thought he was nuts. We don't like perfect people because what they do is illuminate our imperfections. And this world is about ruining the reputations of others in order to achieve some kind of political agenda. So, yeah, obviously Jesus' enemies didn't think he was sinless. If you are a promoter of the Roman way, Well, then all of those Jews living in their backwater of Jerusalem, they're all fools and idiots, and why don't they get with the Roman program? And if you're part of the Jewish liberation movement of the first century, the Romans are pagan corruptors, oppressors, and imperialists. And what really needs to happen is God needs to come down and give those evildoers what they deserve. And if you're really a purist, then all of the wobbly fellow Jews that are collaborating with the Romans are even worse than the Romans because they should know better. And that's just the prejudiced of standpoint epistemology. We all see the world from a perspective. And so then we're going to color people according to that perspective. So, all right, Job, did you have something you want to say, Job?
Well, maybe. I'm struggling with atonement theory, but it's kind of a long question to ask in the end, so I don't know.
You can at least give us a little clue now. Now you've got us all teased.
All right, so here's the thing. I've been reading through the Apostles' Creed, trying to figure out what I'm possibly going to say yes to if I do proper confession in a Christian Reformed, Dutch Reformed Church. So there seems to be the strong idea that Jesus died for our sins. So God died to save us from sin, from death, and there's of course the old chestnut of God dying to God to save us from God. That seems a bit too much of a short circuit. But I'm kind of struggling with the idea of, okay, so I'm guilty of sin. Well, by definition, because I'm not perfect, especially not in comparison to, let's say, perfection embodied by a perfect God. But then there's the whole, okay, therefore I deserve death. But in it goes into the whole difficult system. Like, why did God create a system in which this is a necessity? Why that such a construction is necessary? Like, God has to save us from Himself so that we don't all have to suffer the penalty for sin, which is a consequence of having free will. It always seems a bit convoluted to me, and it kind of rubs me a bit of a wrong way how people can get a bit, at least I find myself getting a bit, what's the correct word? I don't know, opstandig. What's the English word for that? Somebody help me out here. What's the right word for opstandig? Recalcitrant, resisting. It kind of, I don't know, rubs the anti-authoritarian, God, I can't find my English words today. You know what I mean.
I know what you mean.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's the whole idea of, okay, so I exist in this system by the sheer point of being born, and now I have to deal with it. And it seems that there's not really a choice when the alternative is death, And I know these are all very basic questions. They're the kind of beginner questions. I notice I'm still thinking about them, even at this point, like, okay, in about 3-4 weeks, I'll be saying yes to a bunch of stuff. And I guess that's why I'm trying to work through them, because, I don't know, being the analytically natured person that I have been cursed to be, I have to figure this out. So I kind of wonder what you think about that and these types of atonement theories, and it all works.
They're good questions. And you're right, I don't, in the limited time, can't really dive into them, and sort of feeling after 2 hours a little tired and probably couldn't give it my best. And they're difficult questions. And there's a reason. I'll say this about atonement theories in general. Sort of like, and brace yourself, Sam, sort of like Trinitarian theories, the elements of their construction are in the New Testament, and there's evidence of atonement theories in the minds of the authors, and even though they never fully lay them out, over time the church sort of constructs them. Why does the church try to construct them? Because we're trying to understand and align ourselves with a set of events that happen and how it works. Now, if you, I did a video earlier this week about the God of the gaps, and I was riffing off rationality rules a little bit, because I like to reverse the God of the gaps problem to imagine a table with puzzle pieces on it. And in this strange table and puzzle relationship, you see gaps in the puzzle that you're trying to work out. And what you sort of have to do, because God number one is the table, is that the puzzle pieces emerge from the table beneath them. Atonement theories are sort of like that, in that what the Bible bears witness to is that we are saved by, and the Bible again has a lot of these elements right there. We are saved by the sacrifice of Jesus Christ, and that gets connected to all sorts of things hyperlink wise in the Bible. Okay, so right there, when you trigger that, you're going to be triggering all of those very good questions that you're thinking about. And then there are these other tantalizing comments in the Bible that seem to illuminate other atonement theories, like the Christus Victor theory, that what happens with Jesus on the cross is that the devil somehow is tricked and is forced to release his captives to Christ. So Christ somehow, being crucified, triumphs over him, and then others push that into the resurrection, that in the resurrection he beats death. And so what you have are all of these, you have these physical realities, you have the interpretation of these physical realities, and you have all of these intriguing, evocative biblical images that talk about our rescue from sin and death. And see, this gets really, if you know, if you look at, let's say, the Exodus story, and God sends the angel of death. Okay, well, what's that? Is the angel of death God? Is the angel of death evil? Is the angel of death Satan? There's a lot going on here that atonement theories try to clarify. But the thing itself is so huge that all atonement theories probably can't exhaust the thing itself, which means that all atonement theories, which are sort of like models, we need them to understand aspects of this far larger thing, but the models can't exhaust the far larger thing because, number one, we are probably not able to take in a model that can fully encapsulate it. And given what we know just from cognitive science about our relationship, even with the room I'm sitting in, I cannot exhaust the complexity of this room. How on earth could a model that I can comprehend exhaust the complexity of, if we go all the way back in this question and answer about the idea that what Christ does on the cross is begins, both exemplifies, and the cross and resurrection, because I don't want to divide them, is the reclamation of the entire material and spiritual cosmos. I'm going to have a model that pulls all of that together? Probably not. So the best we can do with these models is illuminate aspects of what Christianity is about in pocketable formulas that we can use to our benefit. Does that help or make sense?
I'm probably going to have to listen back to this some other time. Oh, seriously, I mean, it's a lot to unpack. And I mean, part of me likes the Christ Victor theory because of what it represents. But yeah, no, I'm just going to have to listen to this again at some point when I can properly focus on it.
Well, think about all of the ways you need to be rescued. Now, you need to be rescued from you. You need to be rescued from the world. You need to be rescued from evil. You need to be rescued from God. Part of what these atonement theories do is each of them sort of highlights the thing you need to be rescued from. And penal substitutionary atonement, which is often forefronted in Reformed churches, tends to highlight our rescue from the wrath of God. Now, that's absolutely appropriate, but it doesn't tend to highlight our rescue from our own sinful fallen nature. It doesn't tend to illuminate our rescue from the devil. It doesn't tend to illuminate our rescue from other principalities and powers. And so all the different atonement theories basically attempt to clarify, take a thing too big and focus in on an aspect that is illuminating of a bigger whole. So I would say that with respect to atonement theories, and with respect to what you're about to do in church in terms of making a profession of faith, I would liken that more to what you did when you made vows to your wife. In that, if someone would have sat down, how old were you when you got married, Job?
Oh, why would you ask me this? I remember that. I don't know, I think 25.
Okay, that's pretty common. 25. I was 25 when I got married. If someone were to sit down and tell you what was happening when you were making vows to your wife in marriage, they couldn't really begin to approximate it. And at that point, the 25-year-old Job could barely take it in. Now, after being married a number of years, you know a lot more about the road that you set yourself on, you and your wife, when you made those marriage vows. And in some ways, that's sort of what's happening in church, in that you're going to get up there and you're going to say, all right, I'm going down a road, I'm making a commitment, and I am not really smart enough, and there's way too much chaos and uncertainty in the future for me to actually comprehend all the implications of what I'm doing here. But I'm looking around and I'm seeing people that I trust, and I'm seeing people that I want to be with. And so let's go. And that's now the church does have you say yes to some propositional formulas, and
Right.
that's fine. But in my experience, most people who stand at the altar aren't thinking a lot about the ins and outs of marriage. They're about to
Right.
live it.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, because I know I'm going to have to affirm some things. And it's like, well, Job, do you affirm that, you believe in God the Father? And then I have to be like, well, I don't know. I mean, that depends if we accept the principle of sufficient reason and the law of the excluded middle. And, I don't have time to get specific about metaphysical presuppositions in front of church. I can. But
Have you looked at the liturgy that you're actually going to be participating in?
no, and there's a couple of Sundays where we're going to sit together with the group and go through these things. Part of me is kind of making a joke about it, but part of me is also like, well, let's say I have to affirm that I believe in, the resurrection of the body. I could, with a couple of asterisks and footnotes, like, well, depends on what you mean by resurrection of the body. And instead of, well, in life everlasting, like, I have no idea what that means, what that looks like, or how that works. So, yeah, I don't know. It'd be easier if I had no questions. I could say, yep, sounds good to me. Let's go. Where's the secret key to the secret room in church that I can go into now? Or something like that.
Church probably doesn't have a secret room. I think it's more like, if you look at the questions that you have to answer in the Christian Reformed Church in North America, they're mostly like, do you trust Jesus? And will you basically serve and submit to the church? And do you promise? Yeah, that's basically usually it. And they do catechesis.
Questions like,
What's
do
that?
you trust Jesus? You can't just ask somebody, do you trust Jesus? It's like, that's a huge question.
Yeah, it is.
I mean, just to say yes to that. I mean, I get what you're saying, in regards to the metaphor of marriage, where you say, well, do you, forever till death do you part? You're like, yep. And, and they get some terrible disease, and you're like, oh God, this is, the worst. And well, then what you promised becomes reality. So yeah, I get that. In that sense, you could say, okay, I trust Jesus even when, I don't know, I'm covered in boils sitting on a dung heap, let's just say. Stay true to my namesake here. Yeah, maybe it's simple enough like that. Could be.
Well, let me ask you this question. Do you trust your wife more or less than when you married her?
Hang on, let me see where she is. Okay, she's upstairs. Do I trust my wife more?
I will answer for you so as you don't get in trouble. My guess is that you both trust her more and less, because now you have a much higher resolution picture of her than when you married. And there's some areas that you're like, gosh, I don't trust her for this, but other areas are like, I really trust her.
But no, but yeah, I get what you're saying. The cooking has been pretty consistent as far as this stuff goes. Oh wait, is this still recording?
Oh yeah, we're streaming out to the world. So
okay.
Why start living in private now, Job? You've been so public on this channel for years.
Oh, and especially her being pregnant, opens up, new dimensions in that regard. And no, that's a good point. It's definitely a whole new level of trust and hope. And
well, even trust is a funny thing, because on one hand, there's one kind of trust where we say, I can reliably anticipate what they are going to do. That's sort of one kind of trust. The other kind of trust is, I can't anticipate what they're going to do, and I don't even necessarily know what they should do, but I'm in. And life is a heck of a thing. It really is. So anyway, I keep talking to your pastor. That's why you have a pastor. And he'll probably laugh too, I think.
Oh, yeah. Well, thanks for the impromptu conversation, Paul. Much appreciated.
Oh, you're very welcome. So I'd say that's it for today and our little question and answer. And thank you all for whoever showed up in the Bridges of Meaning voice chat room. And thank you for whoever has been listening on the YouTube live stream. And Rick, you can end transmission.